The champagne should have tasted like celebration. Ava Monroe tried to convince herself it did. Tried to let the glittering chandeliers and the 1,000 shimmering candles persuade her that this was the turning of a page. She lifted the crystal flute to her lips as the orchestra swelled, and for a heartbeat she allowed a tiny spark of hope to warm her ribs. Maybe, if she could just be gracious enough, brave enough, this new life would soften at the edges. But the bubbles fizzed bitter on her tongue, like ash on a long cold hearth. Across the opulent ballroom, beneath a riot of lilies exploding from a massive silver urn, her new husband stood with his back to the party. Dr. Adrian Whitmore, cardiac surgeon, heir to the Whitmore empire, the man she had said vows to under a cloud of camera flashes 3 hours earlier, was a solitary silhouette of rigid shoulders and immaculate tailoring. He looked like a portrait someone had hung and then forgotten, an expensive object set at a careful angle. He believed no one saw him retreat like that. He was wrong. Ava saw everything. She watched as he slid a phone from the inner pocket of his tuxedo, watched the way his thumb moved over the screen with the distracted muscle memory of a man calling up a private altar. The expression she had endured all day, the cool, exacting indifference of a surgeon charting statistics, melted like ice dropped into a warm glass. In its place rose something naked and devastating, pain so unguarded it made her pulse stutter. He didn't know he was making a face like that. He didn't know she would recognize it. His jaw locked. His eyes gentled in a way they never did for her. Curiosity, that old traitorous creature, overrode Ava's sense of propriety. She took a half-step closer, close enough to catch the glow reflected in the curve of a silver picture frame nearby. The image on his phone was glossy, professional, backlit by a strobe of paparazzi flash and framed by a cityscape. The woman in the photograph had dark hair that spilled like ink over a white silk gown, and a smile that looked like it had been captured mid-laughter because the world had just told her another joke it couldn't help but love. Every billboard in America knew her name. Sloane Vale, the supermodel with a jawline carved by a sculptor's dream and a laugh that made strangers feel invited. The woman Adrian Whitmore had been supposed to marry. He lifted his hand, a small, unconscious movement, not to swipe or scroll, but to touch. It was so tender, it felt scandalous. His fingertips hovered above the screen, trembling. The wistful ache in that gesture punched a little hole beneath Ava's breastbone. It wasn't jealousy. It was the grief of watching someone worship a star you could never become. He seemed to feel his own vulnerability like a sudden chill. With one sharp motion, he locked the phone and shoved it back into his pocket. The careful mask snapped into place so hard she could almost hear it click. He turned his head, his eyes, storm gray, calculating, swept the room. For an instant, they met hers. There was no flicker of recognition, no silent apology, no spark that said, "I see you." His gaze moved across her the way a boardroom strategist's gaze moves over a spreadsheet, cold and impersonal, pausing only to assess liabilities. Later, when the last camera had finally been escorted onto the curb and the last fluted glass had been collected with quiet efficiency, the charade continued. He accompanied her to the penthouse suite like a security detail escorting a dignitary he didn't particularly like. The elevator opened into an expanse of glass and shadow. The city beyond lay like spilled diamonds on black velvet, but the suite itself felt unlived in, as if a show home had been staged to look like a life. "Your room is here," Adrian said, stopping at the first of 2 doors. His voice was flat, untextured, physician neutral. He might as well have been indicating a set of surgical gowns from a supply closet. He gestured down the hall, toward another shut door at the far end. "Mine is there." There was no invitation in his tone, no possibility, only terms. This was not a marriage. It was a housing assignment. "Fulfill your role, Mrs. Whitmore," he added. The name landed oddly on his tongue, like a word in a foreign language he'd memorized phonically. "Smile for cameras. Attend the galas. Be a credit to the family name. That is all I ask." He turned his back and walked away, his footsteps hardly louder than the hum of the penthouse's hidden ventilation. A man vanishing into his own separate life. leaving Ava standing in lace and beading that suddenly felt like costume jewelry on a borrowed body. When the silence pressed too tightly on her throat, she peeled herself out of the gown, one trembling tug at a time, and let it pool in a white lake at her feet. She stood barefoot on cool wood, the city's glow painting her collarbones, and reached for the one familiar item she'd smuggled into this alien orbit, her ancient laptop. The hinge creaked, homely and reassuring, as she opened it and typed his name. The screen populated in a flood. Headlines, photo carousels, 1,000 different angles on the same story, reframed across a dozen languages. Billionaire surgeon Adrian Whitmore and supermodel Sloane Vale announce engagement. Inside the Whitmore Vale wedding plans. A match worth billions, the merger of hearts and brands. Then, like a scalpel catching the light, the newest headline, dated 2 weeks ago, sat above a photo of two perfect smiles turned away from each other. Shock split. Whitmore and Vale call off wedding of the century. The truth didn't simply dawn. It hit her like a sudden lurch in a descending elevator, like your stomach reaching up to catch your falling heart. She wasn't just a bride of convenience in a family chess game. She was a replacement part hastily installed to keep a machine eligible for the board meeting. He looked at that woman, like a man stares through a locked window at a house that used to belong to him. And Ava, even in her brand new ring, even with her legal claim, was a stranger perched on the porch. Desolation spread through her chest in a slow, hollow ache. She wandered through the penthouse like a tourist in an empty museum after closing. Marble that showed no fingerprints. Velvet that had never been crushed by the weight of anything unscripted. Everything gleamed, nothing breathed. Then she saw the piano. It tucked itself into a corner of glass and night, a grand instrument with its lid propped like a wing, watching the city with proprietary serenity. A small bench sat next to it, so polished it reflected the chandelier like a pool. Her fingers moved toward it without permission, craving the anchor of keys under skin the way a thirsty mouth reaches for a cup of clean water. She sat. The ivory felt cool, familiar, like the palm of a friend. She did not play a piece she had been taught. She did not play scales or anyone else's ghosts. She let a note fall into the stillness, and then another, listening to the way the room hummed around the sound, to the way the night outside pressed its ear to the glass. A melody grew, tentative at first, then willing, then raw. A line of minor chords reaching toward something like home. It carried within it the clean ache of a sore throat you won't admit to, the rumble of thunder that doesn't quite break. It said, "I am lost." It said, "I am learning the language of this loneliness. I have been here before." She was so deep inside the music that she didn't hear the door open. "That melody," said a voice from the doorway, low, warm, with an old sadness polished by kindness. "It's been in this house for years. It's just never been given permission to speak." Ava's hands flinched off the keys. She turned fast, her pulse skittering. It wasn't Adrian. It was his father. Marcus Whitmore had a face built for both boardrooms and firesides. Handsome in a way that hadn't grown lazy. Charismatic without being loud. His dark hair threaded with dignified gray. His suit loosened by an unbuttoned collar and a dark tie pulled slightly askew, as if he'd walked out of a different life to find this room. He held a snifter of something amber and complicated, and in his eyes there was a reflection of exactly what the piano had been trying to say. "It's beautiful," he said, taking a few steps in, as if careful not to spook a skittish animal. No showy trills, no performance, just a heart telling the truth. "I know that sound." He looked at her, and it wasn't the look people saved for Mrs. Whitmore, latest installment of Family Optics. He saw the woman at the keys and the hurt that had sent her searching for the right resonance. For the first time since the vows, a sliver of warmth slid beneath Ava's ribs and settled there. She nodded once because if she tried to speak, she wasn't sure what would come out. The next morning, the penthouse dawned in a wash of pale sun that made the crystal light fixtures look like icicles in a thaw. Ava found the vast dining room hushed, except for the distant hum of the city far below. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped the space, turning the table into an island on a glass sea. Coffee waited in a polished silver pot. Toast sat under a monogrammed dome like a museum exhibit entitled Domesticity. Adrian stood by the window, phone to his ear, shoulders tense, voice pitched low in a way she had not yet heard. It held heat and urgency and a threat of helplessness that made her stop in the doorway. "Sloane, just listen." His voice was a soft command wrapped around a plea. "It isn't what you think. You know what this is. It's a contract. It's optics. That's all. You know the terms." He paused, the carved line of his mouth tightening. No, I can't walk away. Not like that. You know what my grandfather insisted on. Please don't, Sloane. Sloane, don't hang." He cut himself off. He hadn't turned, but he knew she was there. He always knew a shift in the room the way a surgeon knows when a monitor changes tone. When he pivoted to face her, whatever had been in that voice, warmth, longing, pain, was gone. Only the blank, clipped mask remained. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Did you sleep?" He left the question unfinished, as if ending it would imply a neighborly interest he didn't have time for. Before she could conjure a civil syllable, Marcus breezed in with the kind of smile that brings air conditioning to a July porch. "Ah, Ava," he said, the name softened by a genuine pleasure that made her feel briefly human. He took in the temperature in the room as if he had a weather barometer under his rib cage. He glanced at his son, then back at her. "Adrian, you look like you're preparing a hostile takeover of the orange juice." "It's only breakfast." Then gently to her. "The gardens below Whitmore Manor are ridiculous this time of morning. If you can stand the scandal of sunlight, would you let me show you my wife's rose beds after you eat?" It sounded like a rescue line someone had thrown without show, fully expecting to be refused and ready to pretend not to mind. Ava clung to it with both hands. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. The contrast between father and son felt like the tonal shift between minor and major. The walk with Marcus was easy, in the way of conversations that do not require you to guard every word like contraband. He spoke of his late wife, Celeste, not with heavy performative grief, but with a gentle, lasting love that left room for sunlight. He pointed out the roses she had planted in chaotic clusters, no board-approved symmetry there, and told stories about the one that never behaved and always flushed the wrong color, which had delighted Celeste because it felt like mischief at the edge of a formal hedge. He asked about Ava's music with the kind of curiosity that leans forward and listens, not because it is polite, but because the answer matters. He wanted to know why she favored Rachmaninoff's darker passages but always ended on a note that tried for the light. What she did with silence between phrases, whether she heard in color. They meandered through art and books and cities they both wanted to return to one day, and he had a way of asking second and third questions that made her feel interesting rather than interrogated. He let her set the pace. He let her be. By that evening, at their first public appearance together, tickets already paid for, photographers already tipped, the charity gala for the Whitmore Children's Pavilion shimmered to life like a fairy tale newly built for cameras. Ava wore a dress another woman might have felt invincible in. She felt like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong set and was trying not to get in the way. Within moments, Adrian was swallowed by a knot of surgeons and board members. Names like Mr. Bellamy and Dr. Nguyen and Chairwoman Summers attaching themselves to his sleeves. "My wife, Ava," he said perfunctorily at one point, with a smile that left no fingerprints, then turned his body toward a conversation about surgical robotics and post-op mortality rates, and the future of machine learning in diagnostics. She hovered at his elbow, invisible ink on a page already filled with more important text. Just as the familiar burn of humiliation rose, swift as a blush, stubborn as a stain, Marcus appeared, conspiratorial delight in his eye, as if they were both bored teenagers at a too-formal party. "Tiresome, isn't it?" he said, sotto voce. "Profit margins over canapes. Laser scalpels in tuxedos. Come, there are people here who know how to talk about life." For the rest of the evening, he was her true north. He introduced her to friends who asked her not where the dress was from, but what she was working on. He steered her toward a patron who had funded a music therapy program and wanted to hear everything Ava believed about sound and the nervous system. He never left her side long enough for her to feel adrift. "This is my daughter-in-law, Ava," he said more than once, with a quiet pride that never felt proprietary. "She's a musician whose hands say more than most people's mouths." He would not have said it if he didn't believe it. Under that gaze, she exhaled. She laughed, an honest sound that surprised her by how unfamiliar it felt, as an elderly donor recounted a disastrous tango lesson he'd survived with his dignity only barely intact. She forgot, for 2 sustained human hours, how her marriage tasted. From a balcony above the ballroom, Adrian watched. He saw his father's hand rest lightly at Ava's elbow as he drew her toward a friend who might purchase a piano for the pediatric ward. He saw Ava's eyes glitter, amused and alive in a way he had never coaxed them to be. He did not feel anger. He did not feel jealousy. Something colder arrowed through him, relief, almost irritated in its practicality. The thought of a duty quietly outsourced. The realization slid into Ava like a blade she hadn't seen being drawn. In this arrangement, she was not a partner. She was an item on a to-do list he had assigned to someone else. Marcus's kindness felt like a balm, yes, but it also threw sharper light on the ghostliness of her role. She had been brought into a house as if she were furniture, and the only person who saw her as a person was someone who should never have been allowed to look at her like that at all. On a Tuesday morning, his next announcement came with all the warmth of a company memo. "I'll be in Vienna for a medical conference for the next week," Adrian said from the breakfast room doorway, crisp suit, leather briefcase, watch face winking. His eyes landed an inch to the left of her head. "My schedule is on the shared calendar. Mrs. Pennington has all necessary contacts if anything urgent arises." Ava looked up from her coffee. Somewhere a reflex conditioned by years of other lives reached for the language of companionship. "When will you land? What time should I pick you up?" The look on his face stopped those syllables in their throats. He wasn't leaving a wife. He was stowing a chair. "The house has staff for whatever you need," he added, then seemed to remember manners in a faded textbook. "Good day." When his footsteps disappeared, when the elevator doors closed, the silence that spilled in was vast and, for the first time, not unkind. It lay over her like the first breath after a held note. Without him, the corners of the mansion felt less like a museum and more like rooms. Without him, her lungs remembered how to expand. It wasn't the space that transformed her. It was Marcus. With Adrian gone, the careful buffer between them evaporated, and the tentative thread of connection from the music room was allowed to thicken. Their days found their own rhythm without anyone orchestrating them. In the mornings, Marcus read the paper to her in the garden. His voice, rich and amused, lent even the business pages a certain narrative tension. He would pause at an op-ed and tilt his head toward her, genuinely curious. "What do you think of this argument about public art?" he asked one morning, as she sketched the unruly geometry of Celeste's favorite climbing rose. "You're the one who hears in color." In the afternoons, the music room became a sanctuary rather than a confession booth. Ava's fingers stopped bleeding into the keys and began to fly. She let herself attempt pieces she had shied from, played not dirges but sonatas that reached for the air like tall grass wanting sun. Marcus sat in a worn leather chair as if it had been shaped all this time for his particular posture. Eyes closed, a soft smile carving tender parentheses at the corners of his mouth. He didn't fling empty praise at her like confetti. He spoke to her in the language she loved, of themes and motifs and the way Chopin's heart broke differently in the left hand than the right. They discovered the joy of old movies with their soft black and white worlds, the relief of a rainy afternoon spent in a library that smelled like bindings and time, the way a good chess match could feel like flirtation if you played it with someone who respected your brain. He told her about his early days, about the first startup Halcyon Medical Systems acquired, and how he'd thought he was building something that would save lives, until his father reminded him to calculate the optics first. He told her, carefully, about Celeste, the woman his family had chosen for him, because she was perfect on paper. And he told her, clumsily and without flourish, about the girl he had loved before that, the one whose death had rearranged the furniture of his soul. In his history, Ava saw a map of her own present, two people who had done what was expected and found themselves lonely in rooms no one knew how to heat. She unfurled. The tension in her shoulders that had been a permanent guest began to pack its things. Her smile, no longer the brittle version she wore for photographers, appeared without being summoned and stayed on its own accord. It felt like turning her face toward the sun after a long winter, and Marcus was the person who had pulled back the curtains. On the 7th day of Adrian's absence, rain came hard and without apology. The sky bruised, the windows turned to gray mirrors. In the library, a fire crackled in a way that made the room feel like a heart beating. Marcus found an old record player in a corner closet behind a set of travel trunks and wheeled it out like a magician revealing a trick he hadn't performed in years. Celeste adored this one, he said, lifting an Ella Fitzgerald album from a paper sleeve as reverently as if it were a relic. When the needle caught the groove, smoke and honey poured into the room and braided itself with the liquid drumming on glass. They didn't talk much. They let the spaces between them fill with music and the kind of silence that actually listens. The light from the fire pulled their faces into softness. "It's odd," Marcus murmured, not quite to her and not quite to himself, as Ella's voice wrapped the room like a shawl. "This house hasn't been a home for 20 years, not since Celeste. It's been a very fine mausoleum, polished, prepared, but this week there's been warmth." He looked at her directly as if he'd decided not to play shy around his own truth. "You brought the music back, Ava." Her breath hitched. "You make it easy to play," she whispered. It was the kind of confession that feels small and is, in fact, everything. The record ended. The rain carried the song for a few moments, then released it. The silence that fell wasn't the comfortable companion it had been all afternoon. It was thick and charged, a new animal in the room, breathing with them. "Tell me your dreams," Marcus said very softly, "not the night ones. The ones that would stitch your days into the shape of your life." No one had asked her that in years. Not since the night the Monroes lost everything, and survival became the only music in the house. Under his gaze, so open and so interested, something cracked and let light in. She heard herself talk about spaces that heal, about hospital atriums that are not just efficient but kind, about sound rooms where children can hear their bodies begin to regulate before their minds have language for calm. She spoke with her hands, carved the air into the shape of sanctuaries, felt tears prick when she spoke about sunlit libraries built for kids who believe only very expensive instruments are allowed to make beautiful sounds. Marcus listened the way other people read poetry, slowly, with respect. "You see the world in music and light," he said, awe warming the words. "That's rare. That's a gift." As if the house approved, a log shifted, sighing sparks up the chimney. The lamps flickered once, then twice, then went out, plunging the room into a soft, amber-dark cocoon. They could still hear the rain and the tiny hiss of the record needle resting where music had been. "A transformer on the corner always goes during these storms," Marcus murmured. But neither of them rose. The sudden darkness didn't feel like an inconvenience. It felt like permission, like the removal of one last audience. He was closer than he had been a moment ago. She hadn't seen him move. The scent of him, sandalwood and old books, and something warm, reached for her. The air between them crackled the way the needle had crackled when it met vinyl. "Ava," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like what it was, a choice. His hand rose. He touched her face the way you touch a thing you've only ever wanted to look at from far away. Thumb along cheekbone, reverent, asking, not taking. The gentleness of it tore through her. It was not the claimant's grip she knew from his son. It was a quiet question that respected the right of an answer. She should have pulled back. He was her father-in-law. The rules that had shaped both of their lives stood in a stern circle around them, arms crossed, waiting. But in the dark, in the privacy of a room built by ghosts, for the first time since her life had been commandeered, she felt seen in a way that was not for any logo or headline. Her own hand rose to cover his and press his palm into her cheek. "Marcus," she breathed, the name a small prayer and a larger admission. He leaned in until his forehead met hers. The soft tick of his breath matched hers. The kiss that hovered between them was inevitable, as if it had been written into every moment they had shared all week, and they were only now catching up to the sentence. It should have landed. It should have rewritten both of them in one soft collision. Then, from the driveway below, the crunch of tires on wet gravel broke the room's slow heartbeat. Headlights sliced across the library windows in a hard arc. The lamps jolted back to life, bright and unflattering. They sprang apart so quickly it would have been funny if it hadn't hurt. Footsteps echoed down the marble hall. Decisive, expensive, familiar. Adrian stepped into the doorway of the library with his travel bag still in hand. He stopped, as if someone had tugged a wire inside him. His eyes took in everything the way a triage doctor takes in a crash. 2 wine glasses on the table, a dying fire, a record needle waiting, 2 bodies standing too close in a room that looked like it had recently darkened to allow something dangerous to grow. He looked at his father. He looked at his wife. He arranged his face into something unreadable and set it there like a chess piece. The silence in the room opened its mouth and became a thing you could choke on. Ava waited for the explosion that would burn her to ash. She braced for rage, for accusation, for stinging words hurled like glass. None of it came. "I see you've been keeping yourselves occupied," Adrian said at last, the flatness so dismissive it was worse than fury. He set his bag down by the door and began unbuttoning the cuffs of his shirt, as if boredom were a choice he had practiced. "I trust my father has been a gracious host in my absence." The insult, disguised as courtesy, landed like a slap. The easy delegation of duty. The implication that Marcus had been doing a chore he'd happily outsource. Marcus stepped forward, even now choosing diplomacy over the satisfying crack of a thrown glass. "You're home early," he said evenly. "We weren't expecting you." The final keynote was canceled, Adrian said, already glancing past them toward a stack of mail on a sideboard. He didn't look at Ava again. Later, when the house no longer hummed with new arrival energy and the rain had almost forgiven them, Mrs. Pennington delivered the message with the calm efficiency of a very good general. "Dr. Whitmore would like to see you in his study." The confrontation was inevitable. Avoidance only paused its timing. Ava went, hands clasped to disguise their shaking. He stood at the window with a glass of whiskey, the city's lights at his eye level in a way that made them look like lines of code. He spoke without turning. "I hope you and my father are getting along. Companionship is good in a house like this." He turned then, and his eyes held only a cold, businesslike authority, the look of a CEO meeting with a department head who had slipped a standard. "Don't forget your place here, Mrs. Whitmore. Your loyalty, per our agreement, is to me. Your public role is my wife. I won't have that role compromised by gossip or impropriety." Not a jealous man, then. A corporate officer concerned about brand integrity. It hurt more than jealousy would have. It clarified. "My loyalty?" Ava said, surprising herself with the way her voice didn't break but sharpened. "You dare?" The dam inside her had finally found a hairline fracture. You spend your nights worshiping a woman who isn't your wife. You clasp a phone like a rosary and pray to her image. You have the nerve to recite the terms of a contract to me like I'm a line item in your portfolio. She expected vehemence in return, expected a denial dressed like righteousness. He took a long, measured sip of whiskey. He didn't look away. "My heart," he said coolly, "was not part of our contract." There it was, the honesty that bruises because it is so clean. "I love Sloane. I was going to marry her. Circumstances and my family's demands prevented that. I married you for the name, the optics, the company. I expect you to fulfill your side of the bargain with the same sense of duty." He wasn't a villain. He was something worse for her. A man who had chosen not to choose her, who viewed that choice as neutral. She became transparent in that instant, a paper doll in the shape of a wife pinned to a bulletin board by a thumbtack labeled "Obligations Fulfilled." Whatever tiny hope had camped shivering in Ava's chest dissolved. She saw her future with a clarity that felt like someone had opened a window to very cold air. There was no door in that fortress that would ever open for her. The warmth she had felt in the library, that sense of being gently cherished by a man who had learned how to listen, was no longer a romantic fantasy. It was the only place she had felt real in months.
"I understand," she said quietly.
"Good," Adrian replied. His body turned back toward the window. Dismissal complete. Ava walked out of his study and left him there with his whiskey and his ghosts. She carried with her a certainty that weighed less than sorrow. She was married to a man who would never love her, and she was falling in love with the one man in this house she had no right to want. The days that followed had a careful, chilly choreography. In the mansion's hallways, she and Adrian moved around one another like strangers in a small town. A nod at breakfast, a photo at a benefit where no one believed in their smiles but everyone pretended. Polite misery laid over every surface like dust. The only warmth in Ava's orbit remained Marcus. But now that warmth was edged. The library kiss that wasn't had turned their friendship into something with a boundary line scorched into it. Their conversations stayed lighter. Their distances increased by inches that felt like miles. Their glances grew laden, lingered a beat too long, then ran away from themselves. A week later, when Mrs. Pennington let slip that it was Marcus's birthday and there were no plans, none, not since Celeste's death, and Adrian would be in the OR for a 12-hour surgery, Ava felt an impulse rise that was part rebellion and part tenderness. She could not fix his years, but she could mark this day so it didn't pass like a ghost. She conspired with the staff like a general with a small, excellent army. She asked the chef for Marcus's favorite dishes and was rewarded with a conspiratorial grin. She slipped into a wine cellar that smelled like damp stone and history and, guided by a delighted sommelier, selected a bottle that had once made Marcus's eyes light. She filled the small dining room near the music room with jasmine, the scent Celeste had loved, and tucked sprigs into silver bud vases that caught candlelight like captured fireflies. In a second-hand bookstore, she found a first-edition volume of Rilke Marcus had mentioned once in a line that had sounded like a sigh. When Marcus walked into that room, expecting another solitary evening, and saw what she had made, he stopped like a man who has stumbled into his own memory. "Ava," he said, the word catching on something in his chest. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from the velvet of her dress to give her hands a task. No one should be alone on their birthday. The dinner was not elaborate, it was simply right. Without the oppressive gravitational pull of Adrian's presence, their caution loosened. They talked, not in circles around their feelings, but about music that had made them cry, about the strangest thing that had ever made Marcus laugh in an operating theater, about the postcards Ava used to collect from airports she knew she would never see. They drank the wine slowly. Candlelight played on their hands when they reached across the table and did not pretend it was for the salt. "No one has done anything like this for me in years," Marcus said finally, laying his hand atop hers as if a weight had just lifted, and he needed to know whether the table would float. "You have dragged light back into this house, back into me." Gratitude and wine and everything unspoken all week climbed up the careful walls they had built and began pulling out bricks. When he walked her to the door of her wing, neither of them wanted to say goodnight to whatever had just emerged to join them. "Thank you," he said. His voice had settled low, all pretense stripped away. "For everything. For thinking to ask the Jasmine to join us. For making an old man feel wanted, seen." He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with fingers that trembled with restraint and too much tenderness. His eyes held a year's worth of loneliness and 1,000 small moments filled with a quiet love both of them had been abusing themselves by pretending not to notice. He leaned in, and this time their carefulness didn't save them. He kissed her, not like a man whose blood was boiling, not like someone staking a claim. The kiss was a hush. It was an apology for the timing and a vow that, had they been given another life, he would have learned the chords she loved and played them until the house sang. It was the gentlest, most dangerous thing she had ever been given. They broke apart because you have to breathe. They stared at each other, terrified by the enormity of the line they had just drawn through their lives. The reality settled like a new gravity. They could not go back to pretending.
They could not tuck their feelings into a corner like a card they had meant to send and never did.
While they were waking up inside a world that had shifted, Adrian was fighting a different battle in Vienna. The week-long conference blurred. Panels, handshakes, filigree coffee cups, jargon that never stopped echoing. And then, a text. "I'm in Vienna for a campaign. I saw your name on the program. Coffee? S." He told himself he owed her a clean cut. He told himself closure was a mature thing, a bag labeled past that you carry to the curb with quiet dignity. They met at a cafe out of sight and beyond the reach of the press, a small place where pastries flaked, and a woman with a red scarf wiped tables with a warmth that would have frightened any Whitmore. The moment Sloane Vale stepped through the door, Adrian's very carefully constructed world tilted. She was, of course, still dazzling, but there was something new in her eyes, a steadiness in the way she moved that spoke of hard-won ground. The edges of her beauty had softened into something more like grace. "I made a mistake," she said, sitting across from him, fingers circling a steaming cup as if it could anchor a trembling that only he could see. "I let the industry, and the noise, and my own fear of being seen push you out. I told myself I could keep everything, and then I found out what it felt like to stand in a room without you. I'm sorry, Adrian. I miss you." The words slid through the ice around his heart and found the man under all that strategy. Suddenly, his wedding to Ava glowed in his memory like a white neon sign in a window of a closed shop. Open for business, nobody home. He remembered why he had loved Sloane in the first place. The quick wit, the color of her laugh, the way she cared about small things with big sincerity. They spent an afternoon together, and it felt more real than the previous 6 months of cold contractual compliance. He walked back to his hotel with a decision in his pocket as heavy and simple as a key. He landed a day early. He entered Whitmore Manor through a side entrance he had used as a boy, because something in him understood that he needed to see the house before the house saw him. He walked past the music room and registered, for the first time in weeks, sheet music open to a piece he knew Ava had been struggling with and had now conquered. He noticed a book of poetry, Rilke, by the library fire, a cup still warm nearby. Signs of life lived without him, soft, domestic, mortal, real. He walked out into the gardens at dusk. There, on the stone bench in the rose garden, he saw them, Marcus and Ava. Not touching, not performing, sitting side by side, watching the last light sift through leaves. It was the easiest silence he had ever seen two people share. He waited for the ugly feeling, possessiveness, anger, to arrive. It didn't. Guilt did. A shape he didn't let himself look at often. He had built this cage and had locked her in it. His father had found a way to slip a hand through the bars. That night, he went where he knew she would be, the music room, fingers moving over unpressed keys, because sometimes silence plays louder than sound. He didn't ease into small talk. He walked to the center of the room and stood with the clarity of a man about to perform a clean incision. "Ava," he said, "we need to talk about the future of this marriage." She froze. The discordant echo of an unplayed chord hung in the air. Her mouth went dry. She had been waiting every day for the shoe to drop, since that kiss outside her wing's door. She prepared herself to be reminded of her obligations, to be threatened with scandal if she so much as breathed wrong. "I'm listening," she said, keeping her voice neutral. He didn't sit. He kept his eye on the truth and didn't let it wriggle away into strategy. "I'm ending our marriage," he said. For a second, she didn't process the words. They had been sharpened and so simply delivered that her brain tripped over their edges. He didn't let the silence swell. "I saw Sloane in Vienna. Being with her again made me realize how profoundly I have been lying to myself and to you. I can't keep doing this to either of us. It isn't fair to me. It isn't fair to her." He paused. "It isn't fair to you." He began to pace, but it wasn't anxious. It was the careful laying out of terms he believed he could keep. "I've spoken to the attorneys. We can begin the annulment as early as tomorrow. We'll cite irreconcilable differences. It will be discreet. My financial agreement with your family stands exactly as signed. Your father's care is guaranteed for life. You gave me the time I needed to secure my position with the board. "You are free, Ava." The word floated, glowing, hovered over her like a gift and a bruise. She braced for humiliation to flood in, for the old, familiar heat of shame to crawl up her neck. It didn't come. Instead, a lightness rose like a bubble in champagne. Free, not discarded, released. She looked at him, this man who had caged himself to please Alexy, and felt a quiet compassion. He was as trapped as she had been. "I understand," she said, and was startled by the steady calm in her own voice. He blinked. He had prepared for tears, for a fight. Her acceptance disarmed whatever defenses he had rehearsed in the car. "You understand?" "Yes." A genuine smile, small and surprising, softened her mouth. "You love Sloane. You belong with her." She stood, a physical lightness in her limbs she hadn't felt since before the world fell apart. "I hope you're happy, Adrian." It wasn't polite, it was sincere. She got to the door before he said her name. "Ava." She turned. "For what it's worth," he said, and in his face was the first unfeigned apology he'd ever shown her. "I'm sorry for all of it." "I know," she said softly. And she did. She left him in the music room and went to find the only person she wanted to tell anything to. Marcus sat in the library, a book open in his lap, eyes focused somewhere the book could not follow. When she entered, his smile was the one safety she had known in months. "Ava," he said, warm pleasure in the syllables. "I was just thinking of—" "I have something to tell you," she said, and the seriousness in her voice folded his smile away. Concern rose. "What is it? Is everything all right?" "Adrian is ending our marriage," she said. The words dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. "He's going to be with Sloane. He told me I'm free." The emotions moved across his face so quickly they left tracers. Shock gasped first. Then, just as quickly, a flare of joy slipped out and tried to hide. She saw it. Pure, boyish, undiluted hope. And then guilt arrived to scold them both for daring to feel it. "I see," he said, jaw tightening, eyes moving toward the fire as if it might have answers. He raked a hand through his hair, a thing she hadn't seen him do, which told her how much he was trying to keep something contained. "Then I am partly to blame. He saw us that night, the way we stood in this room. If he believes something happened, Ava, I'm sorry. I never wanted to risk your position, your dignity. I never meant to—" "No," she said, stepping closer, kneeling by his chair to force his eyes to hers because sometimes the truth needs proximity. "Look at me." He did. "This decision is his. It's Sloane. It's him. It isn't us." Relief softened his face. Reality settled back in with a different weight. Her marriage would be over soon, and whatever door that unlocked, the world outside it was still loud and full of judgment. "What does this mean?" he whispered. "You'll be a divorced woman, and I?" He let out a small, humorless huff. "I am your ex-husband's father." This would be a scandal drenched in gasoline, the board, the family, the glossy magazines. We would be crucified, Adrian's reputation, my own. He was right. The rules of the world they had been bred to hold up were rigid iron bars welded by decades of expectation. Love that did not ask permission from those rules had never been invited in. Marcus was a Whitmore. Duty had been seared into him so early that his nervous system registered it as basic safety. Ava watched him begin to build a wall inside his chest for his own heart to huddle behind. Resentful and obedient, and something fierce rose in her. "I don't care about the scandal," she said. The strength in her voice surprised both of them. "I have spent this past year living a lie so a ledger would balance and a brand would shine. I will not give the rest of my life to other people's optics." She held his gaze, heart in her eyes like a flag. "My only question is for you. Do you care? Do you care?" It was a clean shot past old defenses, past polite instincts, past everything that had kept him out of his own life. For 20 years, since the loss of the woman he had loved before Celeste and the arrangement that had followed, he had learned to live in grayscale. He had done well by his duty. He had raised a son. He had sat through meetings as if they were prayer, and had taught himself to call obedience peace. And then Ava had walked into his mausoleum with music in her hands. He had told himself the feelings that had followed were a trick. Fatherly, protective, a mirror thrown up by loneliness. The kiss on his birthday had ripped that illusion into ribbons. Now the path in front of him was visible. Narrow, thorny, scandalous. But visible. He looked at her, kneeling, luminous with a new defiant hope, and understood that she wasn't asking him to be reckless. She was asking him to be alive. "Yes," he said finally, the word torn from some place that had been quiet for too long. "God help me, Ava. Yes, I care." He swallowed. Honesty demanded the rest. "I care about the scandal. I care about Adrian. I have spent a lifetime putting Whitmore first." Ava's face dimmed, and she began to pull her hand from his. He tightened his fingers around hers and wouldn't let her go. "But for the first time in longer than I can remember," he continued, voice straightening like a man who has decided to stand in his own body, "I care about something more." He brought her hand to his mouth and set a kiss on her knuckles that felt like a vow. "I care more about the thought of you walking out of this room and never coming back." Tears rose and spilled before she could pretend they wouldn't. They didn't hide anymore. In the days that followed, the house became the site of a quiet revolution. True to his word, Adrian set lawyers in motion. He kept his distance, not with icy disdain, but with the preoccupation of a man focused at last on a second chance he believed he deserved. He seemed almost relieved to relinquish his grip on the shape of everyone's lives. Ava and Marcus moved like conspirators, not against someone, but for something. Their stolen moments were filled with more truth than most people's entire days. They charted a map of a future that had never been drawn in any family's heavy leather-bound book. Afraid? Of course. But fear respected them now. It watched from the doorway and let them work. And then the paper came back from the court. The annulment was finalized. Her name became Ava Monroe again. The realization was both dizzying and sobering. She was free. She was also, quite suddenly, a person without a home. She could not stay in Whitmore Manor, not because anyone had told her she couldn't, because to remain would be to stay stitched into the fabric she had just painstakingly unpicked. She folded the few clothes she recognized from her old life and laid them into the same suitcase that had carried her across the threshold that first day. The gowns and jewels that had clung like heavy vines to her body stayed in the closet, a costume she would no longer wear. She was zipping the suitcase when a shadow fell across the doorway. Adrian leaned on the frame, hands in his pockets, wearing a face she had never seen on him, hesitant. "So," he said, looking at the suitcase but speaking to her instead of to the room, "you're really leaving?" "I have to," she said. "It's time I found my way." "Where will you go?" She laughed softly because life has a sense of humor. "I don't know yet. I'll figure it out." A pause stretched between them that wasn't cold, wasn't brittle. It held a quiet respect, born of mutually inflicted hurts and a strange, earnest freedom. "My offer stands," he said at last. "You don't have to struggle." "I know." She gave him the first unguarded smile she'd offered him since the day she agreed to become a solution. "But I need to do this. At least for a while." He straightened from the doorframe. "Be happy, Ava," he said. Sincerity lived there. He turned to go, then paused, glancing back once. "And my father, he's a good man. He was lonely. You woke up this house." He left her with that unexpected benediction. Ava took a breath that tasted like an open road. She lifted the suitcase. The weight felt right in her hand. She was stepping toward the door when the voice that had been her tether since that first night in front of the piano came from the hallway. "Don't go." Marcus stood there, color drained, eyes raw, all his practiced composure abandoned in the doorway like an umbrella he didn't need anymore. He looked at the suitcase as if it were a verdict. "Or," he said, voice cracking through a decision, "if you must go, take me with you." Her heart stopped, then raced like a metronome that had been wound too tight. "Marcus, I can't stay in this house without you," he said, stepping in. The vulnerability pouring off him made her chest ache with its beauty. "It will become what it was before, a beautiful object, a mausoleum. And I will become what I was, a ghost pacing his own halls." He crossed the room with intention and lifted his hands to cradle her face. She pressed her palms over his wrists and felt the drum of his pulse. "You said you didn't care about the scandal," he said, gaze steady. "I have spent a week trying to convince myself I do, that my duty and my name and my son should be the pillars of my life. I was wrong. None of it matters if you're not in it." He looked at her the way a man looks at a horizon he has dreamed but never believed he would reach. "I love you, Ava. I think I have since I stood in the doorway and heard you play that sad, beautiful piece that sounded like my heart. I knew then that I wasn't the only one haunting this place." Tears slid warm and steady onto his hands. He didn't swipe them away. He let them mean what they meant. "So I'm asking you," he said, "stay and we'll face what comes. Or leave and I will walk out with you with only what matters. We can build something, somewhere no one knows our names. But choose us, please." He held out his hand. Not because he doubted she would take it, but because this is how you announce you are ready to be chosen. Fear lived still in the corners of her mind, but love burned brighter, a clean, warm flame. She set her suitcase down and put her hand in his. "Us," she said. It was the truest thing she'd said all year. They went to find Adrian, because that was what it meant to be adults. He sat in his study, blueprints spread across his desk. Lines and measures and load-bearing calculations for a wing he might never build. He looked at their joined hands and showed no surprise. There was only a weariness that looked a lot like relief. "I see," he said. Calm, clear. "Adrian," Marcus began, and his grip on Ava's hand tightened like a promise made to both of them. "We love each other. We intend to build a life together." Adrian leaned back and, for maybe the first time since he was a boy, truly looked at his father as if he were a man separate from a title. He turned his gaze to Ava and saw not a placeholder, but a person who had found the door to her own life and walked through it without apology. A small smile, not cruel, not ironic, but oddly peaceful, found his mouth. "I suppose," he said, humor a dry thread through his voice, "we all get to be happy, however complicated the route. Be happy, Ava." She took his offered hand and squeezed. "You too, Adrian." The blessing, such as it was complete. They decided not to hide. If their first act as a couple was shameful, the shame would burrow deep and live under their skin. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was a week later. They walked into the ballroom together, hand in hand, and an audible gasp hit them like a wave. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the over-polished patriarch-in-waiting, and the woman who 7 days earlier had legally been his daughter-in-law. You could feel the headlines writing themselves in the corner. "Can you believe the audacity?" whispered one sequined shoulder to another. "She went from the son to the father, predator. Poor Adrian. Humiliating." Ava's hand trembled once. Then Marcus's thumb stroked the back of it and steadied her. He leaned down, lips brushing the curve of her ear. "Let them talk," he said, voice low and certain. "What they think isn't oxygen. You and I are." She lifted her chin. She smiled up at him, radiant and unafraid. They moved through the room with dignity so calm it was its own kind of rebellion. They greeted those who looked them in the eye. They did not explain themselves to anyone who clearly did not deserve the story. They didn't stay long. They had said what they came to say without opening their mouths. In the cool night air outside, their breath mingled and plumed. As the car pulled away, the hotel's glitter turned into distant stars Ava didn't need to wish on anymore. "Are you sure?" she asked softly, head on his shoulder. "About leaving all that up there?" He turned her face to his. "I am not leaving anything worth keeping," he said simply. "For the first time in my life, I am choosing something that is actually mine." They did not flee the city. They did not disappear into exile. They chose to stay, but not in Whitmore Manor. A week after the gala, Marcus packed a few clothes, a set of cufflinks, a dog-eared photograph of a very young Adrian laughing with an ice cream cone as big as his head. He handed the keys to a stunned but understanding Adrian, nodded once like a man shaking hands with a building, and stepped away from the house he had stewarded for 3 decades without looking back. Their new home was a historic brownstone on a tree-lined street that smelled like bread on Sunday mornings. The front steps were wide enough for neighbors to sit on and talk. The wooden floors creaked in polite warning that you were coming. There was a slightly unruly garden out back, where lavender had gotten above itself and threatened to take over. The living room boasted a bay window that made sunlight into a presence. It cried out for a piano. The first piece of furniture to arrive was exactly that. Marcus had it moved with the care of a man transporting a child. When Ava sat on the bench and set her hands on the keys for the first time in their home, the melody that poured out didn't carry loneliness the way her earliest notes had. It lifted, it layered, it promised. A life began. Not in grand gestures, in small, sacred routines. It was waking up late on a Saturday because the rain had made the bedroom a cave, and Marcus's warm arm across her waist had persuaded sleep to linger. It was coffee exactly the way she liked it, always waiting by the time her feet found slippers. It was reading in companionable silence, her toes tucked under his leg on a faded velvet sofa, the lamplight a golden pool around them. It was Marcus shedding the armor of bespoke suits and finding he preferred soft sweaters and jeans and a leather band for his watch. It was the kitchen filling with the smell of garlic and onions and butter because he remembered he loved cooking. The small chaos of dinner for two made him happier than a table for 200 had ever done. It was him standing in a doorway unable to speak for a moment because he had walked in and found her mid-phrase, head bent, brows drawn in concentration, and he had been sucker-punched by love. For Ava, love's revelation was in the way he saw her when she hadn't done anything presentable. It was his delight in her brain. It was the way he called her brilliant when she solved a harmonic problem he didn't even have language for. He gutted, drywalled, and painted the top room, the one with the best view of the garden, until it was a studio with acoustics as perfect as he could make them. He told her, serious and reverent, "There is a symphony living inside you. The world deserves to hear it." Under his faith, she flourished. The woman who had tiptoed through Whitmore Manor as if she might set off an alarm dissolved. She began giving piano lessons to kids who'd been told that certain kinds of beauty were outside their budget. She watched a little boy named Eli, whose hands shook when he arrived, steady himself by finding middle C. She cried unapologetically in the small bathroom off the studio when a girl named Marisol played a simple melody and then looked at her hands as if they had just learned a secret. The outside world didn't vanish. It never does. There were still whispers when their names showed up together in a society page. There were people who crossed the street rather than share a sidewalk. But none of it reached through the warmth of their rooms. Their home was a shield you didn't have to hold up. It just existed around them like air. One crisp afternoon in October, an invitation arrived, cream cardstock thick like old money, gold ink, understated and sure. The names on the line struck a complicated chord inside Ava as she read them. Dr. Adrian Whitmore and Miss Sloane Vale. She handed the invitation to Marcus, her breath catching in ways she didn't analyze. "It's the end of something," she said softly. He searched her face. "We don't have to go." She looked around their sunlit room at the tumble of sheet music, the painting she'd started in the corner, the life that held them. There were no ghosts here. "We should," she said, "not for them, for us. So we show up not as a scandal, but as a couple with a story of our own. So we prove to ourselves what we already know, that we are allowed to be happy." He understood. "Let's go celebrate all kinds of love," he said, smiling. "Especially ours." Weeks later, as she buttoned a simple black dress and slid on shoes that wouldn't hurt, a wave of dizziness rolled through her like a tide hitting shore. She gripped a chair back, breathed. "Ava!" Marcus was there in an instant, hands warm at her back, concern carving lines deeper at his mouth. "You're pale." "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled with something new, fear wrapped in possible joy. Lightheaded. It passed. It did pass. The question did not. The next morning, alone in their bathroom with its cracked tile she wanted to keep because she liked the story it told, she stared down at two pink lines and felt her entire life change under her feet. Her hands shook as she walked downstairs. Marcus looked up from the fire and his book, his face going from concentration to worry when he saw her. "What is it?" "My love, you look—" She couldn't speak. She held out the test like a relic. He took it, read it, looked at her. Joy detonated. It lit his face from the inside, erased 10 years in an instant. He laughed, a sound deep and warm that made the walls feel like they widened. He pulled her up into his arms and spun her once, childlike, unable to ground all that happiness without making his body move. "A baby," he whispered, forehead pressed to hers, eyes bright. "We're having a baby." Our baby. The words wrapped around her like a blanket. She had been brought into Whitmore Manor to secure a legacy, to produce an heir for the wrong man under a contract written by people who thought they understood future and had no poetry in their bodies. Now she was here, in a small house that smelled like coffee and paint, carrying a child made from love that had not asked permission and refused to apologize. A year later, she stood in a summer garden at a wedding and didn't feel like a ghost. The sun drenched everything, gilding joy without making it unreal. Sloane was radiant, yes, but human. Eyeliner slightly smudged from crying, hair slightly rebellious in the humidity. Adrian looked like a man who had released his grip on a set of rules and discovered that the world did not end when he did. They walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, and their eyes found Ava and Marcus in the crowd. There was no awkwardness, just a handshake of gazes that said, "We all somehow got where we needed to go." Adrian's nod was a small, sincere acknowledgement. Sloane's smile was warmer than any she'd ever worn for a camera. It suggested friendship. It suggested gratitude. At the reception, Adrian and Sloane found them near the lemonade. "I'm glad you came," Adrian said, sounding like a man who meant it. "It was beautiful," Marcus replied, shaking his son's hand. "We're happy for you both." "Thank you," Adrian said, and the word "dad" in his mouth carried the weight of a truce they had both wanted for years without knowing how to ask for it. Sloane turned to Ava. "The piece you composed for the processional," she said, eyes kind. It made half the room cry. "I'm so glad you liked it," Ava said. She had written it as a gift, hope in melody, a line that said there is more than one way to get where you're going. They stood together for a few minutes, two couples whose lives had collided in ways that had broken things and revealed others. Not a traditional family, but family all the same, tied not by a contract but by a story that had demanded honesty from everyone. Later, as the music drifted over the lake and the sky layered itself in color, Ava and Marcus found a bench and sat. He wrapped an arm around her and rested his other hand over the swell of her belly, where their child kicked hello. "Who would have thought," Ava murmured, watching Adrian and Sloane spin clumsily and happily on the grass, "that a loveless marriage could lead to so much love." Marcus pressed a kiss to her hair. "I think the love was always here," he said softly. "It was just waiting for the right people to look it in the eye." The Whitmore name had once meant duty carved into marble. Now it meant something else too. It meant two families, two improbable love stories born from the ashes of a broken plan. Ava, girl with music where most people kept fear, had been forced into a gilded cage and had learned how to pick the lock. She had become a catalyst, and in the process, she had found something she had almost stopped believing in, an authentic, inconvenient, necessary kind of love. She looked up at Marcus, at the kindness in his eyes, at the stupidly beautiful curve of his mouth. The pages in front of them were blank. The pen was in her hand. She knew how to write a symphony.